L.E.T. Life Enhancement Training programming is a program that this is the third video of 4, and I'm really reflecting and using this video as a teaching video for those students who are taking the program right now. And of course, for others in the general audience, you're also obviously welcome to engage in these videos, to make comments, to ask questions, and that's basically how we learn. So after the first class, there was a theme that arose in our discussion, and these mothers, particularly women who were in the program, are talking about a real key thing to this attraction to the program is that they do not want to pass on their hurts from the past, their sort of more, quote, dysfunctional or, quote, more fear-based ways. They don't want to pass those on of what they learned in their lives and their families and in the culture too, and just pass that on to their children as if it's habit, as if that's the way it is, as if that's what children need to learn because then they'll be able to adapt to the world. Well, children do need to learn a lot of the intelligence that we've gained in life, and that will help them adapt to the future world. And also, even if it's not children you're teaching, it could be your peers, it could be your lovers, it could be your partners, it could be anybody that you're wanting to pass on the best intelligence you can as a human being to others. And that's, to me, just part of a good social life. It's part of a good capital L life where we pass on the best of what life has to give. Even under very distressing, sometimes very oppressive conditions, we can still pass on the best. So they were very attracted to that, and that makes a lot of sense to me as a sort of first way to come on board with understanding this L.E.T. model that I'm teaching and the process of moving from a culture of coping to a culture of healing. So ultimately, that's what I'm encouraging all students of the L.E.T. program to learn, is how to pass on the healing intelligence that we have, the defense intelligence that we have, how to protect ourselves, and how to do that in a very protective and healthy way, not just protective and securing way that is actually unhealthy, that creates boundaries that are more like walls to the world. And that's when a human being starts shutting down all their natural zestfulness, their creativity, their spontaneity, and their love and compassion. So I wanted to just mark out what I saw as a couple main themes from that first session, and then the latter part of this video I'm going to go over very briefly the 10 natural healers, which is part of the second aid of the L.E.T. program. Again, if you want to watch earlier videos, there's 2 other videos on L.E.T. that are available on my YouTube. Really important to get the background, and that will help you too. So you are part of a movement if you're taking this L.E.T. program. And the movement I've put down as sort of 4 basic aspects. First, you're part of Citizens Against Fear-Mongering. And fear-mongering, of course, is the unnecessary use of fear in situations which overcreates more fear in the situation than is necessary. And it re-stimulates, a word I'll get to in a moment, a lot of our past fears that we're carrying from the past, from hurts, unhealed painful memories. And these are all languages and terms that are really important in the L.E.T. program, and understanding how hurting happens and how healing happens and what happens to our inherent good nature when we are hurting, distressed. So fear-mongering, that's a key part. Citizens Against Fear-Mongering was sort of the social justice action part. It's the transformative part of transforming society, not just ourselves. We have to change our environment, which is our culture. That is so a part of conditioning everything we do, right? I mean, that goes way back into our history of the culture of different generations being passed on. So again, if you don't want to pass on want to pass on the good stuff, not the not so good stuff that was hurtful. And that's a really reasonable goal for this course. So how does those hurts get passed on and re-stimulated without a healing model? It gets re-stimulated because a coping culture doesn't define healing in a very effective way. And we are all very short on really good education about hurting and healing, even on the first principle that if you're hurt, you heal. That's the first principle of this model. And the other way, if you don't have that understanding and to look for the healing that comes when you're hurting, that's natural, inherent, and those are going to be the 10 natural healers I'm going to talk about in a minute. Laughing, crying being one, just two off the top, is that if you don't look for and nourish those natural healers that emerge for us, which are the gift from big life, that's like the gift from evolution itself, from creation, whatever you want to believe in as the nature of the universe and how it works, how it grows. And we're a product of that process of creation, evolution. So if you look for it, you'll find the healing, and that will take you to a higher level of quality of being, to a virtue of being courageous, to fearless in the common use of that language. But it's certainly moving from a culture of fear to a culture of fearlessness is a term that I will use in this course, moving from a coping culture to a healing culture. You can see those are parallel notions. So how is a coping culture very typically passing on hurts from its past that are unhealed? And it does that through the process of re-stimulation. So this diagram gives a good example. This is from a poster just recently from the elections, and this is not about parties, political parties, which party I'm for or you are for. It's just showing how the advertising works. And if you read that carefully, especially the highlighted words like dividing, cutting, slashing, hurting, and trying to pin that down that somebody or something, the enemy, the opposite, right, the different, other, is creating all of these, and therefore, is to be not trusted. Well, what kind of view does this message here? It's highlighting these terms that are really re-stimulating of how we've been hurt: dividing, cutting, slashing, hurting. They're all invasive terms. They're all terms related to violence. And they're being used very carefully. They're being highlighted in a bright color in these posters. This is just one example of how a coping culture just continues to pass on the hurts to the next generation, to the next election, to the next opposition, that hopefully people are using this kind of language, which is really fear-mongering. It's a violence language, a re-stimulating to try and get people's attention, right? Because it puts people in fear, and so don't vote for them, vote for us, because we have the hope and we are the great other solution. So that is a pattern that you could find in many different places if you start to analyze. And part of the L.E.T training is learning to be critical and literate about when is a coping culture being spread through that kind of diagram, poster, advertisement, and that could be anywhere. And when do you, as a critical learner now, making a distinction between a coping model and a healing model, and coping language and a healing language, a language that doesn't help us and a language that actually would really liberate us? That's the goal of the distinctions we're making. So that's just one example of things I want you to pay attention to in this course, and even watch when you might use that language or others use it to dramatic effect, right? Trying to get attention and exaggerating certain conditions, even though there's some partial truths to perhaps that language of a coping language. there's partial truths. It's partly true, perhaps, arguably, and that's fine. But when you only use it, so they end off the poster that this party, this person is hurting you. It's hurting Albertans. And it was interesting in the Jason Kenney, who won the Alberta election, used the term Alberta is hurting in his victory speech. And of course, he has a solution to that hurting. I think it's really interesting that we're using that language these days, and that's a good thing. But what we don't have is the balance with when hurting, then where's the healing? But a politician, in this case, using a very political language, only in that coping framework of understanding reality, the best solution Jason Kennedy comes up with, and it could be, again, any leader that would say this, is jobs. And that's what he repeats. And I'm not saying jobs aren't important to perhaps helping where we go, but then you got the question of, well, what kinds of jobs and what quality of care is given to people working in those jobs? And that's all the way from top people to lower people. Are they really being cared for and operating in an organization that's actually, moving from a culture of fear to a culture of fearlessness, culture of mistrust to trust, culture of domination to a culture of some kind of equality and fairness? So all of that language you can see of the political rhetoric that in this case is a coping language, right? Because Jason Kennedy is not saying anything about how to heal. He's just saying, let's just put work in place, and then that will help us cope better, or at least we'll be less distressed, which may or may not be true, maybe partially true, but it's certainly not enough from a healing perspective, from a L.E.T perspective, a life enhancement perspective, which this course uses. So coping is the challenge to move beyond. We still will always be doing some coping until we get this healing model and practice instead of habits, healthy habits, to working for us, right? So let me show you another diagram. Again, as you develop this critical literacy, found this is a really cute little cartoon. Yeah, it almost sort of makes us laugh a little bit, and laughing is one of the natural healers because we see this and we see a certain kind of pain. We see a certain kind of injury, even though, in a sense, both parties are being quite calm in this diagram. She's attempting to say, this is how I'm declaring my boundaries, and you can see she has to perhaps do it in this extreme way to get the attention from the others in the family. And this looks like could be a husband or a partner or a friend or whatever, we don't know. But she's using this extreme way, right? Again, this exaggeration, just like the poster I was showing you from the politician, we sort of use these extreme ways to dramatize of how we're hurt, we're overwhelmed. She's basically saying, I've had enough. I have to set boundaries. And both of the women in this course, and it could be many, it could be men, it could be anybody, but it happens to be a couple of women right now. And they're also mothers, and they know how difficult it is when you're home and in situations and or working where we're trying to set good, healthy boundaries for ourselves so we don't take on too much of other people's needs, don't over care give to the point of burnout, and all of these other symptoms that and behaviors that I'm sure most listeners right now are very familiar with if you spend any time reflecting on your life, small life. And that it's not always very satisfactory how we set boundaries, and the reason is because we haven't really been shown and haven't been educated to be critical and aware and sensitized with language that helps us declare, I need a break, is what, in some ways you could look at that drawing, that cartoon, I need a break. Now, so one of the questions I asked is this a coping way of coping, or is this a way of healing? Is this a coping diagram indicating a coping culture? or a healing culture? And as you pause and think about that, there'd probably be many responses. So that's a discussion we could have, and you might even want to put comments on this video around that. So my point was, and I think it's fairly recognizable for most people that make this distinction between coping and healing, that this would be a coping behavior she's attempting to utilize to help her regulate, right? To get that basic self-regulation of lowering the inputs and the stimulations of what she has to handle in a day, especially other people's needs and distresses that are around her. And whoa, I need some time. She's reading a book. Yeah, I would like it to know if that we don't know the title of the book is, but if it's a book, it would be on, when you're hurting, how to heal. 10 steps or something. It may be a novel. It may be something that is distracting and relaxing to the brain. Or may even be a puzzle for some people because they enjoy putting their attention on that and they don't have to think about some of the negative and more other challenging things. Well, all forms of coping, not to make those wrong or bad. But the main thing I see in the diagram is there's no sharing of feelings and there's no communication beyond, I need my boundaries, and she's trying to say this is not, about an attack on you, but I need them and I desire them. Below that, it's actual natural to have limits as a human being on what you can take and handle, and we need to learn our limits. It's often very difficult to learn what limits are. So that's part of the teaching of the L.E.T program. And then what she doesn't say is that I'm doing this so I can go into a healing process. And the other part of the healing process is not being in isolation, wrapped in your boundaries or wall, or closing the bathroom door and going inside. I mean, it's a start, right? So what is the healing process? How does it happen? And she really could be saying in this diagram is, okay, I've had enough. I actually am hurting right now. Like psychically, I'm in pain. You could even say I'm suffering. I've just had some really bad things happen today, quote, bad things or hurtful things, which would be the more healing language. And I feel, quote, violated even or transgressed in my boundaries, and I really need to push back. So the healing model, one of the most fundamental principles is that when you're hurting, a healing process will begin, and that's by starting to get in touch with these natural healers, which I'm going to go into very briefly here and just list them for you. And you need unconditional attention. That's what I call the oxygen, in a sense, the good stuff. Some people might call it loving attention, caring from another that's non-judgmental, that is not saying, what's wrong with you? He could say, what's wrong with you? Why are you going on the couch? You're lazy. You're trying to keep away from me and the responsibilities of the house or the kids or whatever. And that's a kind of abuse of an attack on when someone's actually trying to heal. So she's trying to heal, and what she hasn't learned in this drawing, and if there was a series of cartoons, she'd say, and if you want to be around me, right, I would like unconditional attention from you for 5 minutes, 10, 15, 20, an hour, where you just really listen to me in this deep, respectful, loving, caring, and healing way. And then she could be starting to teach him and share her book and knowledge, share your wisdom on the intelligence you're gaining about the difference between coping and healing, and you could be sharing that with others around you. So that's part of a goal of this program as well. And you'll have your own specific goals within this L.E.T program, and that's fine. That can be a very diverse set of goals for you reaching your human potential and your better side of your nature. And it's an education process. It's too bad that most people don't understand the healing model. So when you're learning it, you're going to start to be a bit unique in what you know. even though we might know this deep inside us, and probably do know it deep inside of us, how to heal. And in fact, genetically we know, but it's been so erased in that knowledge, that intelligence from a coping culture. So that's why we have to go back and now deconstruct how a coping culture oppresses and represses. So that would be the definition of a hurt, is very quickly, 4 levels of hurt is that you get hurt by a transgression that's actually a wounding, an attack of some kind. That can be very subtle, right? Just somebody saying, you're lazy, you're this or that in a negative way, which is hurtful to you. And that would be a simple way. There's also, of course, physical hurting, whether it's an accident or someone actually attacks you physically. And that creates, again, a hurt. It's a transgression of your integrity as a human being, as an organism, as a living system. You don't deserve to be treated and be hurt. But we will get hurt. And so if we hurt, there's, without going into despair about it, is that we can know that we can heal. It's when we don't know we can heal and we're hurt and repeatedly hurt, that's when we get into despair and into the spiraling down circle of a sense of hopelessness, helplessness, and what's the point of even living, really, when it's only going to be more hurts. Well, yeah, a lot of people live like that. A lot of humans in history and our ancestors have lived like that. Because for a long, long time, and that's a theoretical issue, we have not had a healing culture. We've moved into a coping culture, and it's creating and exacerbating a whole lot of violence upon the planet, of other beings, and humans. That's a big philosophical and theoretical discussion, historical. We can have it in this program if people want that. I can go into it, but really, I want to say we're in a movement that's going beyond fear mongering or this kind of hurt mongering and passing on hurts to shifting to a healing culture. And so the 10 natural healers are the ones that arise when we're hurt. So let me go through them. Just so you have a list. I mean, there's a lot further discussion that we'll have in the classes on how those healers, laughing and crying, for example, is the first 2. And they're very similar physiologically, and they just like laughing can bring tears, right, when you really get into a deep laugh. And that laughing can be really useful to releasing these tensed up, distressing energies. And that's really important to the beginning of self-regulating, right? That first kind of part of the healing process. But to make healing in this model fully a healing, not just a discharging of energy, that's useful but not enough to get to the painful memories that are connected to every hurt. Because in some sense, every hurt's sort of connected in a web. And you'll get triggered by a hurt today that comes from an incident that triggered you. And you'll go, yeah, it even pushed my buttons and I had this exaggerated reaction. Well, that's because you probably have other unhealed painful memories that are similar to that one that you've had. And those have not been healed in the past. So they're connected in a net. And you can get an exaggerated response because you haven't had the right healing attention on the original hurts when you were much younger. And those can go back right to birth and pre-birth injuries, even traumas, as some people call. So that's what we're attempting to do here, is to bring laughing and crying back as healthy natural healers or refreshers that will bring you back to a more flexible condition when you release that distress and tension around those painful memories. And some of those painful memories might be like brand new, or not memories, but they would be painful in the moment and hurtful. And then some are going to be connected to painful, hurtful from the past. right? And we can learn to distinguish, is this a new hurt that's coming to me, or is it connected to an old hurt I've had from the past that I'm still carrying around? And some of those are very unconscious, so they will get triggered without you being consciously aware that they're coming from the past. But that's part of the work. I'm not going to go into that in this video of how to access those painful memories with this oxygen, as I say, the loving and conditioned from at least one other. So that's what brings the full healing. Is you might go into a laughing or crying in a session when you're getting attention in this peer counseling model that's part of this program. And then you talk about it after, and your partner, your ally is working with you, or could be two allies listening to you, unconditional attention for a period of time that's timed. You will be reevaluating, rethinking through, getting perspective, which is so important to create a better story, a more accurate story of what went on in the past and how you are handling it now. So you don't want to be blaming yourself now because of how you're handling things. You may know that it doesn't feel it feels inadequate, or it's not as flexible and intelligent sometimes in how you handle things. That's the reality. And you're basically freeing up your attention through this emotional fitness that I've talked about, which is fundamental to what this program is. In a way, it's a way to talk about it. Freeing up a flexibility, fitness, and emotional fitness for handling life and being more flexible and intelligent on solving problems day to day or big problems in bigger worlds. So that's part of the movement you are. So I'll just list the other yawning, shaking, trembling, two other natural healers. Talking spontaneously when you're hurt and talking about the incident, which you see very naturally. These arise from children, all these natural healers very quickly before they get suppressed by the culture, by parenting, by other adults, by even peers who start to all collude in the culture of fear languaging and way to not be a healing culture. So we start stopping these and we inhibit these, or we allow maybe a certain one in certain situations. Like laughing is a little more acceptable than crying, for example, in our Western culture. However, if you're just laughing all the time and making jokes about everything, everything's a laughable situation, even laugh at people's hurts or your own hurts. And you might think, well, that's a good coping mechanism, but it certainly is not a healing mechanism. And that's why those people who practice those kinds of use of laughing as a coping mechanism can actually it can be used to laugh at other people, right? And actually hurt people. So it can actually be a weapon. Without, again, necessarily intended, or often sometimes intended. And that's just because the distortion has happened in the thinking, and there's a confusion around, well, why do I use laughing all the time, and why does it become such a big part of my life? And some people can use crying that way. You could even use crying as a weapon of controlling others when it's not in the healing context, and when we've not mastered and relearned intelligently how to get those healing mechanisms back in a good way, right, for healing purposes, for building care and compassion back in the world and in our lives. So the next ones are talking spontaneously and righteous indignation. I mentioned righteous indignation is kind of that righteous no, anger. We'll do a lot of discussion and practicing of these and reclaiming them. And then there's touching, and sweating is another indicator and an important part of healing. And then spontaneous creation making, which is doing something creative with your body, your hands, your mind, to create something new and spontaneously, is a really important part of, like, making art is just one example, and that could be music and so on. Dance. And then dreaming is the 10th natural healer. So again, we'll go over those many times, and I'd like you to memorize all those 10 natural healers, because there may be more, and if you want to increase the list, but just for this theory and this program, those are 10 that are really useful and have been shown in the past for many decades of work to be really useful, to take us from beyond coping to healing. And again, when those are suppressed, for example, child's hurt, automatically wants to cry to get attention and to release the healing chemicals that come with crying, which has been researched. And then that gets suppressed with, don't cry, you don't need to cry, and other, even worse, being hurt for actually trying to heal. It creates a deeper injury to the human being. And then eventually we can internalize that message, right? Of, I guess I'm bad, I guess I should be ashamed of crying and being, quote, a baby, being weak, being not brave, being timid. And that can then go deeper and deeper to the point where you actually get hurt in a coping culture by your own internalized forgetting that actually healing exists as an option. So you're always making coping choices instead of healing choices. So we'll go over that in fine detail, but at least 4 different levels I know of how hurt can go down and go in and go deeper and deeper. So as I wrap up today's, this is long enough video, the healing model is to transform from this coping processes and learning how the coping works. It's a very systematic form of oppression. And in the first classes, interesting as we talked in the group with the women, that it was kind of really a lot of oppression on mental health that we feel, and I feel this, and if you study it, you will watch how you're sort of made to feel bad in a way that you have, quote, mental problems or emotional problems. And that often, even when you're hurting and you're feeling these natural healers coming up and you can be crying and feel sad, someone, even in a caring, intended way, will say, well, what's wrong? And it's that moment that you hear wrong. That's what a coping language, a coping way of thinking approaches hurting. So it says what's wrong and tries to make something wrong, and even though they might be trying to be caring and compassionate. So that language needs to change. It has to change for us to not feel shameful for doing our healing work. We ought to do healing in a society as natural as breathing. And all those natural healers that I listed ought to be seen as natural and good and healthy. And of course, we have to learn how to use them. We have to manage those natural healers. We have to fit them into the world of the complex world of coping, which we still live in a coping culture, but we are and can begin transforming through these practices. And that's contradicting the way the average or the normal is. So if people look at you and think you're a bit abnormal in the way you're behaving, in a healing point of view, you're doing exactly what's natural. And from a coping point of view, you can be seen by others and will be, I can guarantee you, a bit abnormal or weird or doing it wrong, actually, because you're not coping like they are. And that's a whole other story of how that coping culture reproduces itself through, I call this mental health oppression or mental healthism, just like racism, sexism, classism, ageism, adultism, religionism, the oppression of certain uses, of certain behaviors and practices and institutional ways of thinking and being can be oppressive to us. So this model works on the notion that we basically are in an oppressive society and we're having to learn to move to a liberational society and liberate ourselves and others with us. Okay, thanks very much for listening to L.E.T video number 3, and look forward to more classes and some other teaching videos that follow, but hopefully this one will be some use for you. I'm sure it will. Let's continue.